Welcome to this Latin American Perspectives podcast. I'm Armando Alvarez, Outreach Coordinator, and will act as commentator. Today I am focusing on the January 2014 issue of Latin American Perspectives, titled Violence Against Women in Latin America. This edition is issue number 194, volume 41, number 1. You can find it online at lap.sagepub.com or www.latinamericanperspectives.com. I have with me the issue editor of this LAP issue. Her name is Tamar Diana Wilson. She is research affiliate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Hi Tamar, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Armando. How are you?
I'm good, thanks for asking. It's a pleasure to have you in the podcast. Additionally, I have an author of an article in this issue who will also be sharing some of her research with us. Her name is Kristen Smith. She is an assistant professor in the Departments of Anthropology and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She has an article titled Putting Prostitutes in Their Place, Black Women, Social Violence, and the Brazilian Case of Sirlei Carvalho. Hello, Kristen. It's nice to have you with us.
Hi, Armando. Thank you for having me here.
I'd like to begin with Tamar. Tamar, can you give our listeners a bit of an overview of this issue? What are the types of violence that are discussed in this issue?
Women in Latin America have been subjected to various types of gendered violence, among them torture and rape during civil war or under military dictatorships, femicide, structural violence, race-based violence, and domestic abuse. In this issue, violence against women in Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, and Ecuador and Brazil are covered. Though there are multiple ways in which a neo-patriarchal order enforces women's subordination, their domestic subordination is guaranteed by a variety of violent acts. Violence by men against women is both a reflection of a system of gender inequality under which women are subordinated and a way of maintaining and or ratifying that inequality. Latin American women may be subjected to domestic violence such as verbal, physical, or sexual, to rape by intimates or as a political tool against insurgents or counterinsurgents or their partners, or to waves of femicide such as that which has occurred in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and in Guatemala, among other countries. Furthermore, there are occurrences of incest forced upon girls in their homes by uncles, cousins, brothers, or fathers and stepfathers, or prostitution forced psychologically or through physical threat. Violence against women also includes the structural violence that keeps women subordinated to men. This may be workplace violence, in which women's bodies are used up in local factories and then trashed on the principle that a degree of turnover is needed to ensure flexibility of production. Structural violence may also take the form of patrimonial violence, as one of the articles in this issue points out. This kind of patrimonial violence is informed by patriarchal norms under which men are favored over women, or even their male offspring, in inheritance and the distribution of land and other property. It is possible to divide structural violence into at least two types. One of these is cultural and ideological, including ideologies such as neo-patriarchy, machismo, and religions that call for the subordination of women and legitimate the violence against them that occurs if they challenge this subordination. The other is social and economic, including relations that perpetuate discrimination against women, such as class, ethnic, and racial inequalities, and modes of production, primarily capitalist, but sometimes articulated with other modes, that underpin violence against women. Some of the types of violence against women in Latin America are included in this issue. In the interests of time, I will mention only 3 of the articles here. Karen Frederick explores the high rates of domestic violence in a rural region in northwestern Ecuador. Human rights discourses, however, have at least partially empowered women to combat their victimization. Nonetheless, men often react to this discourse with further violence, and in most cases, women lack the institutional, legal, political, and economic resources to combat the violence perpetuated against them, and are thus faced by violence on a structural as well as a personal level. Mali Talca's contribution examines the position of rural, primarily indigenous women in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, who have organized in reaction to the structural violence caused by neoliberal policies, including the Plan Puebla Panama, initiated by President Vicente Fox following in the footsteps of his predecessors. Their involvement in combating neoliberal structural violence, Talcott argues, has led them to challenge violence against women in its numerous forms, including those related to poverty and class exploitation, racism, and patriarchal practices. Sarah England looks at changes in legislation in Guatemala aimed at combating femicide and pervasive sexual violence against women. These types of violence are widespread and not only historically rooted, but normalized since the time of the conquest. England makes the point that, whereas men are usually found murdered by gunshots, women are, quote, often found with signs of sexual violence, torture, and dismemberment, unquote. She finds these femicides to rest on a continuum of violence against women that range from atrocities committed during civil strife to everyday practices that are intrinsic to the society. Another article presented by Kristen Smith, who discusses the structural violence that is embedded in the racism, gender discrimination directed against Black women in Brazil.
Thank you, Tamar, for that overview. Now that we have some information regarding what sort of content this issue of Latin American perspectives grapples with, I'd like to turn to our author, Kristen. Kristen, can you please share with us a bit of an overview of what your article is about?
Yes, thank you. This article is a reflection on the intersectionality of violence against Black women in Brazil through a look at the case of domestic worker Cele Dias de Carvalho, who was beaten at a bus stop in the early morning hours in Rio de Janeiro in 2007 by a group of upper middle class white mestizo young men because they thought she was a prostitute. The article deconstructs this case and its implications in order to argue that there were multiple layers of physical, structural, and symbolic violence at play that defined this moment, and suggests that this kind of social violence against the Black female body is in actuality a disciplining moment that not only reflects racial and gender subjectivity, but also defines it in spectacular ways. Acts of disciplining like these, in actuality, define the social contract in Brazil, articulating the boundaries of citizenship and belonging in the nation against the backdrop of the Black female body in pain.
In your article, Kristen, you make mention how some believe that Brazil is a racial democracy. However, you argue that race and gender are fungible, meaning that they can freely replace one another. What do you mean by that?
It's not that I'm saying that race and gender can freely replace one another. I'm also not arguing that race is somehow fluid and nebulous. Rather, I'm arguing that race, gender, and sexuality are intermeshed, so much so that you cannot talk about one without talking about the other. In addition, although we know that race is not a biological fact, we must also acknowledge that it is a social reality. In order to understand how this functions within a space like Brazil, where people often think of race as something intangible, we have to understand the ways that a concept as slippery as race is in actuality constantly being defined and concretized in our everyday social encounters. Specifically, violence is one performative act that not only emerges in response to race and gender identity, but in fact defines race, gender, sexuality, class within our society. Consequently, when Miss Carvalho was beaten at the bus stop, she was beaten not because she identifies herself as a Black woman, which she does not. She identifies herself as a Patha woman, but because she was marked as a Black woman, i.e. read as a prostitute at that moment. And indeed, the violence that was done to her in actuality marked her as a Black woman as well.
And Kristen, your article not only points to violence, it goes beyond that because it highlights more important things at play. And to put it in your own words, quote, bodies that are violated are not simply fractured by violence, but are coated with meaning, unquote. So in conclusion, can you share with our listeners what these acts are a representation of?
For me, this means that we must read these moments as transtemporal, meaning that they are related to discourses of race, gender, sexuality, and class that have circulated and accumulated in societies like Brazil over time. And before you mentioned racial democracy, I think that racial democracy is an ideology that summarizes this in many ways or condenses this in many ways. But also, we must read these moments as disciplining moments. What do I mean by this? Well, in the article, I engage with the work of Saidiya Hartman to suggest that moments of social violence against the Black female body in Brazil are enacted in order to define the moral, racial, sexual, social boundaries of the nation. In other words, Brazil, as a patriarchal nation, as a racial state, is a space where gendered, racialized violence declares who belongs as part of the fabric of the nation and who does not, who is a true citizen and who is not. Admittedly, this is a controversial idea. We know Black people are the majority in Brazil and therefore the majority of the citizenry. However, as scholars like Teresa Caldeira and James Holston have argued, all Brazilian citizens do not enjoy full citizenship rights. Class has everything to do with this, but so do race, gender, and sexuality. And when we examine moments of violence, we can begin to observe the ways that society itself defines these boundaries by permitting and or perpetuating violence against the Black female body. And what happened to Ms. Carvalho in 2007 is an excellent example of this. And one of the things that I do in the article is really try to read this particular moment in conversation with the ideologies and the discourses of racial democracy. And in addition, think about some of the other non-conventional ways of thinking about violence, i.e. symbolic violence, and linking that to some of the grotesque representations of Black women that you find in the Brazilian media, particularly the use of blackface to represent Black women in the Brazilian media. And so in thinking of it in these ways, I want to think about these moments of violence as in conversation with one another, but something that is consequential for our understandings of the politics of citizenship.
Thank you, Kristen, for sharing your research with us. I'd like to thank both Tamar and Kristen for taking time to share their research. For all our listeners, you can find this issue titled Violence Against Women in Latin America and its contents on lap.sagepub.com website and also latinamericanperspectives.com. Don't forget to check out LAP on Facebook at facebook.com/LAPjournal. Thank you again for listening, and until next time.